Okay, thanks for joining us for another video. Today we're going to start a new series on faith and reason, what they are individually and how they relate to each other. And we're going to start with, in a certain respect, there's a sequence between reason and faith. But what we're going to do is we're going to start here with faith and talk about what that is. In my experience, Michael, I think a lot of people sort of have a basic understanding, even if they might not be able to define it, of what reason is, but what faith is, I think, has many people are very confused about that, what it is. Many people believe that faith is something for which there's no good reason to believe.
Right.
Faith is somehow what if you don't, it's irrational. It's contrary to reason.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of confusion about faith, and so in some ways it makes sense to start with that, since it is more unclear to people. So what we'll do today is talk about kind of what that is, what it's not. So Michael, why don't you just kind of map out, give you a little bit of an outline of what you intend to cover today, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So, as Ryan said, the series is going to be on faith and reason and how those two interrelate to each other. But before we can understand how they interrelate to each other, we have to understand what each of them are. And as we clarify that, it becomes a lot clearer how they relate to one another. So, what we're going to talk about today, as Ryan said, is about what faith is. A couple of distinctions that are going to be important is between human and divine faith. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about tradition as well. But before we get into that, the initial question in treating any subject is to ask, what's the nature of what we're talking about? So when I use the term faith, or when the church and her tradition uses the term faith, what is meant by that? So faith is the acceptance of a truth not seen based on the testimony of a witness. So if I know something, and this is consistent with, and I will probably talk more about this later, one of the things that St. Paul says in Romans is faith comes from what is heard. And so it's the acceptance of a truth, not based off of your own knowledge of it. You can think of our knowledge beginning in sight, and we can talk more about that later. But faith is something that comes from what is heard. So someone else has seen it firsthand. There were a couple of problems within modernity related to faith. One was can be seen by Kant, and in the common conception of modernity is the idea of reason being the sole criteria for anything that you hold to be true. And so this is commonly called rationalism, that there's really not a place for faith. Another problem is associated with existentialism and Kierkegaard, and that is seeing faith as inherently irrational. And there are problems with both of those paths we're not going to get into. But the first thing that I want to address is that really it addresses both of those ideas, those false ideas together. It's the idea that faith is not inherently irrational, and that really addresses both sides of it. It's not an irrational act of the will, and once you understand that, then you understand how it fits with reason, and you don't think of it as something that is against reason. So examples of how it's reasonable to accept testimony. There are lots of things that we accept on the basis of testimony. And this is the key. I mentioned faith is the acceptance of a truth not seen based on the testimony of a witness. Fundamentally, when you have faith in something, some proposition that comes from someone, your faith is most fundamentally in that witness. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But there's all sorts of things that we accept to be true, and it's reasonable that we do so, based on our confidence in a credible witness. So, for example, our identity. None of us remember when we were born, but we accept from our parents that we belong to them, that we are their children. We accept something so significant as our name and our identity. is something that we receive on the basis of faith. In law, science, and medicine, faith is operable there. In law, for example, eyewitness testimony in police courts and in court cases. So a police officer arrives on the scene of an accident, and there were a couple of witnesses that saw the accident, and one of the witnesses, say, is a mechanic, and he said, it looks to me like their wheels locked up, and I think their tires are a little bit worn, and so they skidded into the vehicle. And then the doctor says, yeah, and it looks to me like the other driver in front of them, the reason they had to stop was because the driver in front of them, it looks like he was having a seizure. Well, the police officer didn't see the accident. So properly speaking, this is not something that he knows firsthand or through sight. It's not something that he knows in the proper sense. It's something that he believes to be true, but his belief is rational. These are credible witnesses. He trusts the testimony that they give. And our entire law court is based on a recognition that there are criteria to assess the credibility of witnesses. So we accept our identity. Our legal system is based off of what is called is based off of faith, this human faith. The sciences work this way. A lot of people think of the modern sciences as being the sole criterion for knowledge, and I don't have faith. I just accept the sciences. The sciences are often operate off of testimony. So examples of this is when someone does an experiment and they post the results of the experiment in a journal. All of the people reading the journal, they do not go and then all of them repeat the experiment in the way just to confirm that the person that did the experiment did it in that way. Often experiments or medical tests are extremely complicated, involved, and very expensive. So everybody accepts the testimony of these credible witnesses, the scientists, that they ordered the experiment in precisely the way that they said in the journal. That's an act of human faith. You're trusting a witness. It's not unreasonable. They're a credible witness. So several things are based off of faith: the sciences, law, our identity. Medicine, we know this when we go to the doctor. If I go to the doctor and the doctor says, okay, I want to do some blood work, he doesn't do the blood work himself. He has his nurse do it. The nurse draws the blood sent to sent to be examined. She doesn't do the examination. And then the blood vial is sent back. And there's a whole string of people relying on one another's testimony that they did what they said that they were going to do, that they tested the blood correctly, and that the nurse drew the blood from my arm and labeled it correctly. And there's nothing unreasonable about any of this. It's just the way that our society operates based off of credibility in witnesses. So one of the things, so I'll stop there. So testimony, this is human faith in credible witnesses, and it's something that is reasonable. It's something that's operable in the sciences and law. It's operable in our life concerning our very identity. So I'll stop there for a moment. Ryan, any comments or thoughts related to that?
Yeah, so the definition you've got here of faith, the acceptance of a truth not seen based on the testimony of a witness. The not seen part is perhaps the not the wording not seen, but the idea not seen is maybe where a lot of people believe that there's some kind of conflict between faith and reason. And to your point about like the police officer, nobody would say the police officer, based on the testimony of some mechanic or whatever, or an accident reconstruction expert, nobody would say to the police officer who said it looks like the brakes locked up, well, were you there? Okay, so you don't really know. The response would be, that's right, I don't know, because I wasn't there. I didn't see what happened, but I have some evidence about what happened. And the evidence could be a skid mark on the road that's a certain length, that's consistent with the vehicle traveling above a certain speed, but below another, and the testimony of someone who's an expert. So the not seen part, the idea, say more about what is meant by not seen.
Yeah, so it's something that is, we're going to talk more about reason, and you had mentioned the order, and in some ways that starting with reason is helpful because it's something, So I'm going to give another example and kind of back into that question through an example. If you're some of the things that you mentioned are very helpful. It's not contrary to reason because you there are things around it that attest to the credibility of the witness. For you to trust a testimony, you have to trust a witness. The witness is fundamental. The witness precedes the testimony. You're receiving the testimony from the witness. And to trust their testimony, you have to trust that the witness is good in two senses. They have to have good judgment and they have to have goodwill. And the good judgment part pertains to with the mechanic. They know what they're talking about when they're looking at vehicles and how vehicles work and things like that. A doctor, he knows the human body. So he's a credible witness in that he has good judgment in those matters. You also have to trust that they have goodwill. So they don't have a reason to lie. You ask, why would they lie about something? And it would be irrational just to perpetually doubt whatever anyone tells you, regardless of anything else. That's not thoroughgoing skepticism is not rational. You'd have to ask a question, okay, why would you think that they would lie? And then there can be other factors that corroborate the witness's testimony. Like, for example, the skid marks that you mentioned with your parents. You could say someone could play the part of a thoroughgoing skeptic and say, well, I want a paternity test to know that you're my dad. And that sort of thing is just completely unreasonable, apart from reasons to think there's something more going on. If I'm Caucasian, if I look the way that I do, and I'm raised in a home and both of my parents are Asian, and they say, we're your mom and dad, I think, okay, there's got to be something more here. Why? And you would then begin to ask questions, reasonable questions. Why does my skin look different than yours? A 5-year-old might ask it in that way. And then they might begin to explain, well, when you were young, we adopted you, things like that. So there's not anything, it's something that you don't see, in that you don't have firsthand, you don't know it. And for us to be able to clarify that a little bit more is going to require a little bit later video where we talk about what knowledge is and how we apprehend truth. But the idea that it's not contrary to reason is that there are corroborating, artifacts or corroborating evidence, but the testimony itself is a form of quote unquote evidence. You're receiving a testimony from someone that you have no reason to doubt their goodwill and no reason to doubt their good judgment. And more than that, with a doctor and a mechanic, you have reason to trust their judgment on these matters and no reason to doubt their goodwill. One of the things, so I'll stop there. Is that sufficient enough for where we're at?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. This definition, acceptance of a truth not seen based on testimony of a witness. Are you saying this is the definition of faith sort of in general, or this is the definition of human faith?
Yeah, so this is the definition of faith in general. What's critical, as I mentioned, when you have faith in testimony, and I'm going to say more about divine faith, but you have fundamental faith in the witness, and it's never, even if they have good judgment and goodwill, it doesn't mean that their judgment is infallible, that it's perfect on everything. And so
you're even accurate.
Yeah, your confidence in their testimony, with human faith, should reflect, it's really a confidence in their intellect and their will, that their intellect is good and that their will is good, that they have good judgment and that they have a good will. They're seeking the truth and they have a good judgment concerning what is true. And your confidence in that really is reflective of the degree of the goodness of their will and the goodness of their intellect. So that's why human faith, there's always a level of imperfection to human faith. But with divine faith, this transitions us into divine faith. It's faith in God, whose intellect is perfect, he can't be deceived, and whose will is perfect, whose will is coterminous with goodness itself. It's the source of all goodness, and he's the source of all truth. So when you have faith in what God has revealed, And we're going to talk more about um, how reason works in working together with divine faith and adjudicating that. Um, it's that faith is in its that it's fitting for that faith to be perfect because it's in God's intellect and God's will. It's in God. He's the witness, the one who's revealing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let's transition then to just to talking about divine faith. It's a faith and testimony that originates from God, and it's guaranteed by the moral and intellectual perfection of God. One of the things that is important about divine faith is that it's mediated. So in the Old Testament, there were the prophets and they were mediators of God's message. Moses was referred to as believed in the rabbinic tradition and in ancient Judaism as the greatest among the prophets. He gave the law, but he was just as David was regarded as a prophet, and so was Moses. So, but the question becomes of how do we distinguish between a huckster and someone who is an authentic mediator of God's word? And the way that we do this is something called the motives of credibility. Now, these are not deductive proofs that the person who is mediating God's message they're not deductive proofs. So they're not seen in the way that reason is seen. And again, we'll talk more about reason, but their motives, they draw us to belief and they point toward the truthfulness of the witness, much like the skid marks point toward the truthfulness of the mechanic. And the motives of credibility, they help us to distinguish again between true mediators and false mediators of God's word. The things that are part of the motives of credibility are miracles. So miracles with Moses, with Jesus, and in the church, in the history of the church. Miracles in the church are really important in pointing toward the church being who she says she is. Her saints are good examples of that. Miracles, modern miracles associated with figures like Padre Pio, miracles associated with canonizations like Mother Teresa. I may loop back to this, but there's a really significant miracle associated with Mother Teresa and an intercession that occurred from someone. And things like at Fatima, 70,000 people witnessing is the most widely attested miracle in history. This is in modern history in the early 1900s. Miracles are motives of credibility toward Jesus, Moses, the prophets, the apostles, the early church, up to the modern church today. And the fulfillment of prophecy is another motive of credibility. I was reading recently in one of the prophets, I think it was Hosea, and it talks about that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So there's no Old Testament scholar that thinks Hosea was written in 100 AD in the wake of the birth of Jesus. So it was written long before the birth of Jesus, but it attests that Jesus would be born and the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. And then lots of other prophecies that coalesce around the person of Jesus. Martyrdom is the marks of the church are often, and holiness of the church is often regarded as a motive of credibility. Martyrdom is very significant as a motive of credibility. And this has been used in a lot of discussions around the resurrection. The disciples are willing to spill their blood. They're willing to, quote unquote, put their money where their mouth is. They're willing to give their life for the gospel. And if it were a lie, if it were completely fabricated, it's overwhelmingly difficult to imagine that one person, much less a whole slew of witnesses, would say, sure, you can crucify me upside down in the case of Peter. In the case of Paul, you can behead me. What I'm saying is true, and I know I'm going to give an account to the judge, the living and the dead. They weren't concerned about the power over their bodies in this life. They were concerned about eternal judgment in the next life, which attests to their sincerity. And then there are other things that can point toward their credibility, widespread credibility of the witnesses, in terms of them not hallucinating. There's not hallucination is not widespread, things like that. Other things that we could talk about. But that's a little bit about divine faith. And then I'm going to give some quotes from the Catechism that talk a little bit more about divine faith. But I think before I do that, I'll stop there. Any thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I want to make a comment on this, the concept of the motives of credibility and the term motives of credibility. Michael, you've identified some of the motives there, including miracles. And as you were discussing that, I was reminded of, and that this is not a uniquely Catholic understanding of the importance of miracles. In the beginning of John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is a preface to the King of France. And in that preface, Calvin admits that miracles are important to verify the authenticity of a particular testimony from God. And what he says there is that his Catholic opponents have charged him and others in the Protestant Reformation as saying, well, where are your miracles that attest to the truth of what it is that you're saying? And Calvin's response is not to deny that miracles are needed. His response is, we're not teaching anything new. And so the original miracles that are attested to in the New Testament, the apostolic miracles, those go to indicate the truth of what it is that we're teaching. Obviously, there's a dispute on that point, but the reason I raise that is to say that even Calvin admitted that miracles are important to authenticate the truthfulness of certain testimony. And I raise that just to underscore, because this language about motives of credibility and also the types of the motives in most Protestant circles, no one talks like that, and today anyway. And most people have no idea that there is a tradition, some tradition anyway, of this within some of the early reformers. So I just want to underscore that even though the name motives of credibility is almost never used in contemporary Protestant discussion, at least the importance of some of those things is admitted by the early reformers. And so the way that the Catholic Church historically has framed out the motives of credibility is much more robust, much more rigorous. Probably the zenith of that kind of framing it out can be found in Garrigou-Lagrange's work on Revelation, or on divine revelation, which is recently, 2-volume work, recently been translated by Matthew Minard and published by Emmaus, I think an academic. So if people are interested in that, they can pick that up and see that at its highest level, sort of fleshed out there.
Yeah, very helpful. I'll make two other comments just working off of that, but there are two other Protestant treatments, C.S. Lewis's book on miracles, which I think I've read a little bit of, and I have Keener's 2-volume work, which I've not yet read, but it's a very, thorough treatment of, and a lot of what they're responding to is modern skepticism about miracles, which is important for that to be addressed. And the ecumenical question about miracles, and in response to Calvin's point, is miracles can attest to a body, to a group, not simply to the apostles, but miracles have occurred. They're occurring right through this day, and this is something that Protestants in general aren't generally aware of. One of the criteria for determining whether or not someone is a saint, and this is rooted, one of the criteria is miracles, 2 of them, not 1, but 2. And one in the life of the saint, that is very skeptically addressed. When I say skeptically, treated with suspicion and critically. They'll have unbelieving scientists say, can you give us an account for why this occurred? And they look for any natural explanation. And then a second miracle that occurs after their death, when someone is asking for their intercession in a situation where, for example, there's no natural known cure. I'll give an example for this related to Mother Teresa. There was a husband and wife. This was in South America. I can't remember exactly where, but they were Catholic. The husband was having headaches. He went to the doctor. He went into a coma, and they found out he had 8 tumors. His head was swelling so significantly they couldn't perform any sort of procedure. They were trying to prevent him from dying. He was really unstable, and they said, we're going to have to wait and try to drain off some of the fluid and then see if we can do anything. While they're doing that, his wife is at a convent connected with a parish, or where the priest is there, and it's a convent that's part of the Order of Mother Teresa. But this is after her death, which I believe was in 2000. Pope St. John Paul II was 2005, and I think she was just maybe 5 years before that, somewhere around there. And so this is after that, and he says, have you ever heard of Mother Teresa? She says, no. He says, okay, this is a picture of her. Let's ask her for her help, for her intercession. And in asking for Mother Teresa's intercession, they began to ask Mother Teresa for her to pray for the wife's husband while he's in the midst of this coma in the hospital. They do that, and a little bit later, she goes up to the hospital. At the very time that they're praying, he wakes up from the coma. He's got all of these things on him. He says, where am I? What am I doing here? He starts taking the things off that come in, and the doctors are shocked that he's awake. And they put him through another CT scan, and all of the tumors are gone. Every single tumor in his head is gone. Of course, there is no medical explanation for that right at the hour when they're praying and asking for Mother Teresa's intercession, that he's completely healed. And this is rooted in Scripture. It's the prayers of the righteous that availeth much. That the prayers of the saints are powerful. And so that's why Catholics ask for their intercession. And this is an example of which there are not just dozens, but hundreds of Catholic saints that have been examined by the Church, and their holiness, their closeness to God is so significant that miracles happen through their intercession, or through their action while they're living. And this relates to Calvin's critique. It's in the Church, that tradition of miracles. We see it in the New Testament. We think of it, wow, if we have true, divine faith, we say, well, Jesus was God and man. He performed miracles. And even the apostles had that. But that has continued even through today. There are holy men and women that even through today. So I've been talking with my children about someone named Alan Ames. He's an example of someone that I think will be canonized by the Church. Dozens and dozens and dozens. He goes around and speaks about the faith, but dozens and dozens of medically documented miracles that have occurred through his praying for people. So, but those motives of credibility point to the credibility of our faith in Jesus, our faith in, but also our faith in the Church. That's part of the faith. I believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I believe in the Catholic Church, and it's the Catholic Church that attests to, through whom we receive witness about who Jesus is. So, just a couple of follow-up comments on that. I'm going to do any thoughts on that, and then I thought,
just for the people watching, the idea, we go back to the discussion about human faith and the example of the car wreck, or the car brakes freezing up. Motives of credibility, as Michael outlined them, would be analogous to, we had the witness who said, this is what I saw, and then there's things that corroborate that, and what they corroborate is the credibility, the reliability of what it is that what the witness said. Those things that corroborate that are the example I gave about the length, the presence of the tire skid mark, the length of that, which would go to show how fast the vehicle was going. If the length is very, very small, then probably it wasn't going very fast. If it's very, very long, well, there's mathematical formula you can use to determine the rough approximate, so those all go to show the credibility of, or the lack thereof, of what it is the person is saying, how believable it is. That's what credible means, how believable that person is. And with human faith, you can have a situation where it's very common actually, where you have two people who are equally of goodwill and equally informed, who say something different about what occurred. And it's often the case where And we all go, well, who's lying? Well, they both might be telling the truth in the sense that they believe what they're saying. They believe it's true, but perhaps one had an angle that the other one didn't have, and they didn't see all the things that the other one saw. So that's the normal thing to do, to compare the testimony of different witnesses and all the circumstances that go into that. All that stuff goes to the credibility of those people. And what we're speaking about here is the credibility of divine people who purport to be conveying divine testimony or divine revelation.
That's the reason that it's referred to as divine. A couple of points related to that. That's the reason that it's referred to as divine faith, is that the object of our faith is God and what he reveals. So it's divine in the sense that God is the object of our faith. Our faith is ordered toward him as a witness revealing, as the ultimate witness revealing. But then it's also, there's another sense in which it's divine, in that God is working through his grace within us. That faith, hope, and love are supernatural things at work within us. And so through the reception of the divine word, faith is born in a supernatural way within us. And so it's both divine in its object, but also divine in the faith within us is God's grace at work within us. So both in its object and in its source. That's an important point to mention. And if it's okay, any thoughts on that, or no? Okay. I thought maybe we would conclude. We'll have more to say about faith in another video, but maybe we conclude with some quotes from the Catechism and John Paul II that talk about faith and the nature of faith. And one of the things that the faith works with reason, and one of the reasons for this is because our pursuit of truth is ultimately a pursuit of the one who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Jesus, in John 14:6, Jesus is the source of all truth. God is the source of all truth. He's the source of the being of all things. And so when we know the world, when we know what is, that's our communion with truth, and we'll talk more about that in another video. But our desire for truth and our desire for goodness is ultimately a desire for God, and that's written on the human heart. So this is a quote from the Catechism. It's where the Catechism starts, Article 27. The desire for God is written in the human heart because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and happiness he never stops searching for. So our happiness, in the virtues, we're seeking our end. We're seeking what we are made for, and in that we find happiness. And our intellect and will is ordered toward goodness and truth, and that is ultimately, it's ordered toward God himself. The search for God, this is another quote from the Catechism, the search for God demands every effort of the intellect, a sound will, an upright heart, as well as the witness of others who teach him to seek God. It's that witness of others that's the important component here related to faith, but it also works with reason, our intellect and will seeking truth. And again, we'll talk more about that in other videos. But just to conclude here, and this kind of foreshadows something that we're going to talk about in other videos related to reason, Pope St. John Paul II wrote an encyclical called Fide et Ratio, Faith and Reason. And it begins, they would name encyclicals based on the first few words of the encyclical, and it begins, faith and reason are like two wings upon which the mind ascends to God. So you can imagine a bird that's missing one of its wings. It's not going to be able to take flight. And so the human intellect, the person, as we seek God, it requires both faith and reason. You can think of this just in the human sciences, as we've already talked about. You know, if you tried to repeat every experiment before you accepted it, and you just wouldn't be able to get anywhere. Or I'm going to have to verify from my parents that, and then you're accepting the testimony of whoever does the blood work, because you don't know how all that works. And so anyways, but faith and reason are two wings upon which the mind is sent to God. They work together in the way that, and they allow the mind to take flight and ascend to God. So that's a little bit of foreshadowing of what we'll be talking more about faith in our next video, but we'll eventually talk about reason as well and more about how they interact. Any other concluding thoughts, Ryan?
Yeah, just to emphasize this point about how for many people, I think they're confused about what the term faith means, and then of course its distinctions, human faith versus divine faith. We've talked a little about those distinctions, but I just want to underscore again how mundane faith actually is. Mundane meaning how daily it is, how
Right.
common it is, how the vast majority of what we believe to be true actually comes by way of believing in the testimony of someone else for
Right.
good reasons.
Right.
Now, if you can believe in the testimony of someone else and you shouldn't believe in their testimony,
Right.
right? Well, that's a different matter. But I just want to underscore for folks how common it is for us to believe something to be true that we don't know to be true, and we can't independently verify or haven't independently verified, but we take it to be true based on the credibility of the person who tells us. Very, very common in many areas of life.
Right. And that's something we could even do a separate video on too at some point, maybe, is about distinguishing between going in a little bit more detail about distinguishing between credible and non-credible witnesses. But
Yeah.
anyways, yeah. Yeah, those are all the thoughts I have. So
next time we'll go a little bit more deeper into faith, perhaps, or we'll start in on reason. This is a multi-series, multi-video series where we're going to be speaking about reason and faith, and then also their relationship.